Law and Order and Restorative Justice. We take an up-close look at the criminal justice system, discussing what works, what doesn't, and potentially how we can get more out of our system for less via justice reinvestment. From Melbourne, you're watching The World from Below. I'm Lizzie O'Shea. Tonight we're joined by Magistrate Pauline Spencer and academic Bronwyn Naylor. Pauline Spencer began her legal career in the community law sector and was the Executive Officer of the Federation of Community Legal Centres. Pauline was appointed as a magistrate in 2006. She sits in Dandenong Magistrates Court, one of the busiest courts in Melbourne. Associate Professor Bronwyn Naylor practiced as a solicitor before joining the Victorian Law Reform Commission. She has since moved into academia at Monash University, where she teaches and researches criminal law and gender issues. We start today's program by mapping the current state of criminal justice in Victoria. Although there has been a decline generally in reported crime, we've seen an increase in reporting rates of certain crimes in Victoria, particularly in respect of violent crimes like assault, which is up 40%, and rape up 9%. These statistics are arguably attributable to the introduction of the Family Violence Code of Practice. But what's going on, Bronwyn? Better reporting or a concerning increase in criminality?
Well, it's always complicated to understand how to read crime statistics, but they are the reports of crime that have been sent to the police. So in this instance, we know that family violence and we know that rape are notoriously underreported. People have tended not to report those offences, even though they're also known to be very widespread. So my view would be that it's probably a matter of increased reporting, because once people know that the police are being more supportive, that police are putting processes in place, that the courts are being more supportive, the likelihood is that more people will report.
So Pauline, 92% of alleged offenders are dealt with by the Magistrates Court in Victoria, and over 90% of criminal cases heard in Victorian courts result in a guilty finding, which is perhaps surprising to our viewers, and that's either through a guilty plea or a guilty finding after trial. To what extent do you notice these changes in reporting in your work as a magistrate in Dandenong?
Well, I think in the time I've been sitting, so since 2006, the biggest change has been in family violence related matters, so assaults, criminal damage and other type of offences that, if you look at them, they're family violence related, as well as breaches which are now called contraventions of intervention orders. So that's been the biggest shift, and I agree with Bronwyn. I think that I think we know that those sorts of crimes have always been happening. I think that now people are feeling more comfortable reporting them, and that's why we're seeing them coming through.
And also I presume that the police are likely to treat these offences more seriously, so they're more likely to report, I suppose, if you're a victim. Would that be right?
I think there's an understanding across the family violence system, police included, that accountability of perpetrators of family violence is very important. So if we're going to actually deal with family violence as a community, we need to make sure that the systems are in place to hold perpetrators accountable. So that means that if reports are made, they have to be taken seriously and acted upon.
So imprisoning people is obviously expensive, it fragments families and marginalises offenders from mainstream society. Since 2000, actually, Victoria's prison population has risen by 44%. To what extent can we improve outcomes for offenders if we look at options other than prisons? Pauline?
Well, look, I think there are a range of options available under our current sentencing law. And so we have things like community corrections orders, we have opportunities within the system to actually divert people away from prison. Obviously there will always be people who need to be contained because they are not safe to remain in the community, but a lot of people who are in prison are there for underlying reasons such as alcohol and drug abuse, mental health, family violence. Either they've been victims themselves or they're perpetrators. So there are people who need assistance to deal with those underlying problems, and there are mechanisms in the community to deal with those problems.
And presumably we'd see high rates of recidivism as well if those underlying causes aren't dealt with prior to sending someone to prison?
It makes sense. I mean, say someone with a drug addiction, which is a chronic medical condition, if they're going into prison and they're not getting the treatment they need, they're still going to have that addiction when they come out. So if you haven't actually had an appropriate intervention, then we're going to have the same problems happening over and over again, and then the community is less safe.
So these are some of the ideas behind the concept of justice reinvestment. Bronwyn, can you explain what that term means?
Well, justice reinvestment was a concept, I guess, that has become particularly popular in the US. So probably in the last even 5 or 10 years in the US, there was recognition that they actually couldn't financially sustain the growth that was going on in prisons in the US. I mean, they have a phenomenal number of people in prison. They have the highest rate of imprisonment in the world by far. So there did come a point when the actual financial issues became really apparent. And so there were quite a lot of governments in the US that started looking at different ways to use the money, which was actually quite radical and quite brave, really, in terms of an expectation that the community expected people to keep being imprisoned for safety. But what a lot of governments have done is to say, we need to use that money in different ways. So in a couple of states, Texas was one that was very significant. They decided not to fund 2 new prisons, but to put the money into better community-based corrections. So I think justice reinvestment in the US has tended to mean shifting costs from prisons to community-based corrections, but what I think is even more useful, and I guess this is the point that Pauline was also referring to, was that there's this notion that you can actually reinvest back into communities at an earlier stage. So if you start putting funding into communities to look at mental health issues, to look at drug addiction, to look at a whole range of issues that are precursors to crime, ideally, you've got much more chance of actually reducing the crime from the start, not just reducing reoffending.
We've also, it's an interesting idea talking about safety as a purpose a purpose of the criminal justice system in terms of protecting public safety and locking up offenders. To what extent do you think policymakers and politicians in introducing things like, cowards punches and punitive sentences arising from those kinds of offences have lost sight of other objectives like rehabilitation and I guess satisfaction for victims, as well as the idea of public safety and that everyone needs to be locked up?
Yes, I think that it's pretty clear that in Australia and in many other countries, there's really been a significant shift towards a more punitive approach to a criminal justice system. So there's been a tendency for governments to see this as something which is simple and quick. The idea of promoting themselves as being tough on crime, it's just kind of a simple slogan, but governments have also seen it as being a good way of getting re-elected. So it's, really, one has to be quite cynical about that as well. And I think that's certainly been recognised. It's been referred to as popular punitivism or penal populism, the idea that you show that you're more and more harsh and punitive in order to get re-elected. It's a very short-sighted approach, and obviously if we're looking at things like safety and so on, it's going to be much, much more important if you look at any sort of punishment that you impose as being rehabilitative. So it ought to be doing something which is actually going to stop the person reoffending, not something that locks them up for longer and longer, ensuring that they're more and more damaged by that experience.
You're watching The World from Below, and we'll be back to discuss the role of women as victims of crime in the criminal justice system after this short break.